Thanks very much, Nathan. So yes, my name's Daryl, and I work for SARCS. It's a Christian animal welfare charity whose vision is that of a world where all animals are enabled to live with dignity, freedom and peace. It seems to me that many people are fascinated with animals, from all those wonderful videos we find in our Facebook feeds of cuddly kittens and all manner of things, to the wonderful nature documentaries showing wild, majestic animals and all that sort of thing. It's a fascination that a lot of people get hooked into when they're children. I had the privilege of growing up on the Isle of Wight. It's a beautiful place to grow up. It's wide countryside full of all manner of wonderful animals. My house was it's called an isolated sort of house. It was there weren't any other houses around it. And so all manner of creatures would pop up in my garden from time to time. You'd find rabbits and moles, badgers, bats. They'd all nip in from time to time. My next door neighbours were cows, and very friendly ones. They would run from one end of the field to the other just for a scratch on the nose and a handful of grass. And in my garden there were actually some spring onions growing there, and they were rather fond of these spring onions, which were quite strong. And they were so strong the vapours would shoot up their nose, and I was treated to the size of a half-ton bovine needing to pick its own nose with its own tongue. It was amazing. When you're a 10-year-old boy, those sort of things are very funny. You know what I mean? But yeah, I used to really love animals as a child. But when I grew up and became a Christian, I felt I needed a theological understanding of animals. Because if animals matter to small boys, surely they matter to God as well. Well, I firmly believe this, which is why, as an adult, I founded SARCS in order to foster theological dialogue and conversation about animals and the issues they face. One of the projects that we did at SARCS was a digital media campaign called the Named in Love competition, which focuses on the theme of naming. The idea of a campaign is that people would send in photos of animals which they named lovingly. We ran the campaign because names matter. Names reflect the stories of who names us and why. Names indicate our identity and our relationships. In the Bible, God grants people names to underline their special callings and God's particular relationship with them. Indeed, within Scripture, there are examples of how renaming can indicate the bestowing of new identities or roles. In John 1 it says, "And he brought Simon to Jesus. When Jesus saw him, he said, 'You are Simon, son of John. You'll be called Cephas,' which means Peter." Names can reflect relationships to God and relationships within creation among creatures. Using positive names, that is to say, names as descriptors which positively reflect our relationship as creatures of God, is very important. In St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures, he names the world as a sister with whom we share our life, and mother who opens her arms to embrace us. St. Francis writes, "Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit and coloured flowers and herbs." St. Francis' response to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation. St. Francis, each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection, and that's why he felt called to care for all that exists. But to learn more about exactly what an animal is, there's no better place to start than the Bible. In the book of Genesis, straight away, humans and animals are seen to establish a close relationship. In the first chapter, God makes animals and humans on the same day. He does this in the same way. He actually speaks life into the dust, animating it and breathing in life. In this way, God creates nephesh, the Hebrew word for living souls or living beings. Genesis 1-2 identifies sea life, land animals, birds, and Adam as nephesh. Likewise, when the Bible refers to all flesh, or kol basar in Genesis 6, it speaks of both animals and humans alike, and denotes a basic kinship that all divinely made creatures share. Scripture also tells how within this dust, which God speaks life into, there dwells something divine. The writer of Genesis uses the word ruach to tell of how the wind or breath or spirit of God brings forth life. Genesis 6:17 and Psalm 104 are both clear that humans and animals share this same spark of life, this same ruach. Now, I think this is particularly important because, according to the Bible, the same life-giving breath that you and I share is likewise shared by all creatures. Surely then every purr, every bark, every roar from God's creatures testifies to a sacred and divine animating force within. The Bible shows us that God cares for all creatures, from whales to ants to humans, and all of creation, by including all within a divine holy covenant promise. In Genesis 9, God says to Noah, "This is the sign of a covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you. For all future generations, I have set my bow in the clouds. This is the sign of a covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Now, I'm not going to say that the whole of the Bible consistently preaches animal liberation from start to finish, but Genesis turns out to be a remarkably pro-animal book. And I think this is because I believe in a God who is a pro-animal God. Animals and humans alike are made by God in love, for the sake of love, and are part of a very good creation. And the culmination of God's love and his covenant promise for all creation is met in the coming of Christ. The Gospel of John tells us that in entering the world, Christ became flesh. The word flesh, or sarx, in the original Greek, is a word which describes humans and animals alike. Flesh is the substance that both humans and animals share. And it's in becoming flesh that Christ shared many experiences that are common to a wide spectrum of species: hunger, happiness, sickness, pain, bereavement, fear. It's within a body of flesh that Christ came alongside all he made in love. And it's Christ, through his own flesh, who makes all flesh new, humans and animals alike. Indeed, Jesus' work in bringing about a future peaceable kingdom is proclaimed throughout Scripture as good news for all creatures. Psalm 36 declares, "Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your judgments are like the great deep. You save humans and animals alike, O Lord." Isaiah 11 envisages a new world, ushered in through the work of the Messiah, where the lion will lay down with the lamb. Paul, in his letters to the church in Rome, tells of how all of creation is groaning and suffering, awaiting its liberation. And that's a liberation spoken of within the book of Revelation, which tells of a new heaven and new earth, involving the destruction of all pain and all death. Hosea 2:18 describes this day. "In that day I'll make a covenant with them, with the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety." The animals, far from forgotten, are included from the beginning of creation to its completion. Indeed, Ephesians 1:10 tells us that Christ's sacrifice is a plan in the fullness of time to unite all things to him, things in heaven and things in earth. Now, the promised end of suffering and death is, for all creatures, is obviously a wonderful day. But I would say, surely we're not meant to twiddle our thumbs in the meantime, waiting for this kingdom to come. I think Jesus teaches us to challenge the established order of things, not to just say the words, "Thy kingdom come," but live them out. Live those words. Live lives as signs of a coming peaceable kingdom, which includes all of creation. And that's why we're called to exercise dominion as God's special creatures who are made in the image of God. Now, if we were to understand this word dominion, it's a bit of an ambiguous word. It doesn't crop up a lot in the Bible. But if we understand what it means biblically, I think the best place to look is look to Christ. Look to how he decides to model and exercise leadership. Now, whilst we don't know everything that Jesus said and did, we do know the contours. Jesus exemplifies a paradigm of inclusive moral generosity. He insisted on the importance of showing love to those considered marginal in human society, and in the parable of the Good Samaritan pointed to a compassionate love that went well beyond the accepted boundaries. This display of radical love and compassion gives us a lens to view animals and the privileged position that we find ourselves in exercising power over them. Jesus taught his disciples that they must not wield power or authority like a tyrant. He says in Matthew 10, "Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." Now, I think this has strong implication for those of us who choose to reflect the servant leadership that Christ asks of his followers. For it seems humans shouldn't lord it over other creatures, but instead seek to serve them. We can see then that Jesus' teaching about how his followers should love others had implications beyond the human realm, and made it natural that kindness to animals should be seen as a faith concern. But sadly, we have not always example of this Christ-like stewardship of creation. Returning to that theme of naming, which I mentioned, the names we think of creatures, names we give to creatures, reflect how we think of them. And a culture that names animals as product, experiment, ingredient, sport, entertainment, do not think of animals as creatures whom God has breathed life, or creatures with whom God has made a covenant. All too often, we have determined that it is our right to treat creation as we like, for our own advantage. When we act as if we can stand apart from the rest of creation and use it for our own ends, we distort the identity of all God's creatures and lose sight of what creation really is. And this in turn has a serious impact on us. But does not the abuse of creation also disfigure our nature and corrupt our true calling? The fact that we are creatures of God, radically dependent on God's grace for our very existence. We are all flesh, kol basar together. Thus, faithful Christian self-perception understands that God's interest extends beyond humans, and that human and non-human animals are fellow creatures who are all dependent on God's grace. To take seriously the fact that God wills the flourishing of all creatures alongside us is not merely to challenge the abuse of creation, it's to challenge ourselves to reconsider our relationship with God's creatures. But how do we live sacrificially and generously in such a culture as ours? How do we join the dots between our globalized consumer society and its problems, our lifestyles and our faith? Well, what I do in my role in SARCS is to call for dialogue about animals and the issues we face, to call for conversations like we're having right now. If this dialogue is to be fruitful, I suggest that the conversations begin with the recognition that animals are creatures of God. In doing so, we follow after Adam in recognizing the enlivening breath of God present within all creatures. So let us shun names such as product, entertainment, ingredient, sport, in regards to our thinking about animals, and instead bring to mind biblical words, nefesh, ruach, kol basar, words of divine justice, compassion, kinship, and above all, love. Such words are the foundation for a very different way of living, one that is generous and abundant and focused on our relationships, and how actually a life focused on the well-being of others becomes a life in which we too find our own well-being. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's David Clough. I'm Professor of Theological Ethics at the University of Chester. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been thinking about the place of animals in Christian theology and ethics. And I'd like to issue a challenge to you this evening, but I want to do that in the form of telling you some stories. So listen to this story. This is a story about St. Macarius, who was one of the earliest Christian saints. He lived in Egypt as a hermit in the 4th century. And one of the stories told about Macarius is that as he was sitting in his hermitage one day, he heard a knocking at the door. And thinking that one of his brother monks was there, he went and opened the door. But instead of finding another monk there, he found a hyena holding a pup in her mouth. She offered the pup to Macarius, and he didn't know why. But when he took the pup, he saw that the pup was blind, and the hyena had brought the pup to him for healing. So he took the pup in his arms, and he spat on the pup's eyes, and the pup could see. And he returned the pup to the hyena, and she was delighted and went away. The next day, there was another knock on his door. He opened the door again and found that the hyena was back. But this time, instead of bringing a pup, she had brought him a sheepskin. And she begged him to take the sheepskin in gratitude for the healing of her pup. But Macarius was not happy. He said, "Where did you get this sheepskin? Did you kill a sheep? Did you take it from the poor people who are raising sheep?" And he said, "I won't take the sheepskin from you." But the hyena bent down and made as if to beg him to take her gift. And he said, "Well, I'll only take the gift if you promise never again to steal a sheep from the poor and deprive them of their livelihood." And she nodded as if she agreed. And then he said, "I will only take the gift if you promise never again to kill for food. And if ever you're hungry, come to me and I will give you bread." And the hyena bent her head as if she agreed and went away, and she never again killed for food. And any time that she was hungry, she came to St. Macarius and he fed her, and he slept on the sheepskin until he died. There are multitudinous stories like this about Christian saints. They seem to follow me around. When I lived in Durham, we visited a little place on a riverbank called Finkel Priory. And one occupant of Finkel Priory was a saint called Godric, who had a hermitage there. And one day a stag was being hunted by the Prince Bishop's hunt, and arrived exhausted at Godric's hermitage. And Godric saw immediately what had happened, and he opened the door of his hermitage and ushered the stag in, and the stag collapsed inside his hermitage. And then Godric heard the hunt outside, so he went out of his hermitage and shut the door. And the hunt arrived crashing at the front of his hermitage, and they said, we're chasing a stag. Do you know where the stag is?" And Godric, who couldn't tell a lie, said, "God knows where he is." And the hunt apologized and went off, and Godric allowed the stag to rest until the stag was recovered. A proto-hunt saboteur, as I see it. I moved from Durham to Chester, and I discovered that the patron saint of Chester, St. Werburgh, used to farm outside the walls of Chester. And one day some geese arrived, and her steward came to tell her that the geese were destroying her field of corn. So she said to her steward, well, go and bring them out from the field and take them into the house. And the steward was a little shocked by this, but he went out and all the geese followed him back into the house, and he shut them up there. But the steward thought, well, I might as well get a meal out of this. So he took one of the geese and killed the goose and had it for his dinner. And the next morning, St. Werburgh got up, and she was coming to release all the geese, but they protested to her that one of their number was missing. And so she asked her steward, he confessed what he had done, and she asked him to bring the bones of the goose. And he brought the bones, and she held the bones in her hand. And as she held them, flesh grew on the bones, and feathers grew from the flesh, and the bird was restored. And she released it into the air, and the rest of the geese flew around several times to give their thanks before they disappeared off. Now, the most interesting thing, it seems to me, about these stories is not whether they actually happened, but why have they been passed down through the Christian generations as examples of what Christian holiness might mean? It seems to me the answer to that question is that some of the passages that Darrell was referring to before gave Christians the strong sense that whatever God's compassion might mean, it couldn't be restricted to the human. And if we fully grasped an understanding of God's ways with the world and God's love for the world, we would recognize that true holiness would spill out beyond the human into a compassion for all creation, which Darrell was mentioning in Genesis 1, but we could find in Psalm 104, where God provides for the needs of every creature. God's speech out of the whirlwind to Job at the end of the book of Job, where God says, you're one small part of my magnificent project, engaging with all these magnificent animals. Darrell reminded us that Isaiah's vision of the first sign of the messianic reign, when the Messiah comes, the first sign will be that the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and there will be peace between all creatures, including humans and other animals. Jesus tells his disciples that not a single sparrow falls apart from your Father. Paul imagines a moment when the whole of creation will be released from its bondage through the freedom of the children of God. And when St. John envisages what the worship around the throne will look like in heaven, in the new creation, he pictures a lamb at the center and living creatures around joining in worship. So it's not at all surprising to me that when Christians came to think about what it would mean to be truly holy, they recognized that it had a more than human component. Fairly recently, I came across a English commentary on the Ten Commandments that dates from the very early 15th century. And it takes the form of a dialogue between characters called Dives and Pauper. Dives is Latin for rich person. And I think it's probably a Franciscan commentary, and Dives generally gets the bad end of the dialogue. But one of the things they debate about when they get to the commandment, thou shalt not kill, is Dives says, well, does that mean we can't kill animals? And Pauper says, well, it looks like the Bible does allow us to take the lives of animals when necessary, but makes a very strong statement that it is sin to take the life of an animal when it's not necessary, or to exercise unnecessary cruelty towards other animals. And Keith Thomas, a historian of Christianity, says that that was the default understanding of Christians for several hundred years, that we had the permission to use animals when necessary, but not to treat them with unnecessary cruelty. And so therefore it's not at all surprising to me that at the beginning of the 19th century, when animals were being treated very cruelly, it was Christians who got together and lobbied Parliament for the first legislation against cruelty to animals. So we remember William Wilberforce as a social campaigner, very active against slavery. But you may not know that he was part of the organisation that one of the founders of the organisation that became the RSPCA and was lobbying for legislation against animal cruelty. And then at the end of the 19th century, when the scientific and medical establishment had got very enthusiastic about experimenting on animals as a way of extending medical knowledge, Christians were at the vanguard of anti-vivisection campaigns because they said they knew that the strong abusing their power and abusing the weak for their own ends just to extend their knowledge, Christians could see more clearly than anyone that that was a profound wrong done to the animals concerned. So I want to lift up for you stories that Christians have been telling each other for century upon century about why the lives of other animals should matter to Christians because they matter to God. And now let me tell you another story. A few years ago, as I was researching the book that I'm just finishing now on animal ethics, I wrote to the local NFU and I said, could you show me around, could you get one of your members to show me around a modern broiler chicken facility? And somewhat to my surprise, they said yes. And so one morning I cycled up to a big set of warehouses in Cumbria, and after various biosecurity measures and putting on special boots and a special overall, I was taken into one of a dozen massive warehouse-like sheds. And I was profoundly shocked by what I saw inside. A sort of place the size of, it felt like almost of a football pitch, completely artificial light. And in front of me, I was told there were 26,000 birds. The thing that I found really shocking was that those birds had all been delivered as day-old chicks 16 days ago. And I asked if I could pick one up, and the operative said that was fine, and he found a bird and put one in my hand, and the bird was just losing its sort of downy chick feathers and was just growing mature white feathers. I could feel its heart beating as I held her. And then I realized that that bird was halfway through her life. So the birds have been rebred and re-engineered so that they reach slaughter weight at 35 days old. So all delivered as day-old chicks, grown, and it seemed to me very like a crop in these windowless sheds, entirely artificial day and night, with human interaction reduced to daily walking through the shed to take out the dead. And then at 35 days old, they were all sort of gathered up by the legs, shoved into crates, which you've probably seen driving down the motorway, to be slaughtered. And the modes of slaughter have been found by the EU to be very, very problematic, and lots of birds not getting satisfactorily stunned before they have their throats cut. That's how we're raising chickens for meat. It was a huge shock to me when I discovered that because we have separated the breeding of hens for meat and eggs, that means when we're breeding hens to lay eggs, 50% of all the chickens that hatch are of no economic value. And so all the male chicks, immediately after hatching, are put on a conveyor belt, and the most humane method, most people have found to do that, is for them to be dropped from a conveyor belt live into a grinder. It's called maceration. And every commercial egg production, including Soil Association organic certified egg production, relies on the maceration of all male chicks that way. And it's not a lot better for the females, who then they're no longer kept in battery cages, as you may know, in this country and across the EU, and I hope we keep to that regulation in whatever way we negotiate Brexit through the current political uncertainties. But they are still caged and in stacked cages in indoor sheds in ways that prevent them from exhibiting lots of the kinds of behaviors that chickens like to do. I'm also really struck by pigs, which are the next most intensively reared animals, which, as you may know, are generally just kept inside for the whole of their lives in close confinement in sheds. And they often have their tails docked because they become so bored in the monotonous environment that we keep them in that they take to biting each other just to relieve the tedium. There was an experiment in Edinburgh where they took pigs out of that intensive facility and gave them access to parkland. And they discovered that they knew all about how to live as they really wanted to. They developed huge nests that the sows would use, and they were very protective about who they let into those areas. They developed particular friendships where particular pigs would choose to spend time together. They were astonishingly clean. They would do all their defecation and urination a long way from anywhere that they would choose to feed. And when the sows came to farrow, they would go half a mile away from all the other pigs to create a safe space to rear their young. And we take all of that social behavior and we collapse it into the horrific monotony of intensive pig rearing, which is the majority in the UK and elsewhere. Now, when I try to juxtapose those two sets of stories that I've talked to you about, I find it very, very uncomfortable. The idea that as Christians we are heir to these stories which show a profound regard for the lives of other animals, and yet we're part of a society which has shown so little regard for the lives of other animals that we're prepared to treat them as just as crops to be raised. The juxtaposition that only struck me as I was preparing to talk tonight between St. Werburgh holding those bones in her hand and restoring a goose to life, and the broiler hen that I held in my hands that was going in the opposite direction really tears at me when I think about it. And it seems to me that it's problematic enough to rely on killing others of God's creatures for us to live, but to do it in this unnecessarily cruel way, just because we want to make it as cheap and efficient as possible. It seems to me that we're now involved in something deeply unchristian, something strongly separated from the things we thought we knew when we worship a God who is the maker of all. Deep in the Christian tradition, there is an idea about what freedom means. And Christian theologians from Augustine onwards said that what it means to be free as a Christian is not to be free to choose anything you like, not to be free to go into a supermarket shelf and pull whatever you want off it. What it means to be truly free is to be liberated from all that's binding you, from all the compulsions that are forcing you to live in a way that is untrue to your deepest being and your deepest identity. Augustine and many theologians who followed him said the freedom God wants to gift us with is the freedom to be our true selves, to fully realize what it means to be ourselves as children of God. And it seems to me in that light, And in terms of the juxtaposition of those two sets of stories, we need to hear a gracious word from God. The good news that we don't need to kill other animals to live. We don't need to kill other animals to live. We're offered a gracious possibility that now enables us to be free from that, from that necessity that was maybe a necessity for many Christians in the past, but is not a necessity for us. It seems to me, as I think about that notion of freedom in the sense, in the context of juxtaposing those two sets of stories, that there's a possibility for Christians today to witness in daily practice to the inbreaking messianic reign of the God who desires for there to be peace between all creatures and will bring it about in the new creation. And there's more good news. It turns out that if we were to stop using other animals for food, or at least stop using them in the vast numbers that we've become used to, that would have very significant benefits for our own health, for global food security. So at the moment we devote 78% of agricultural land to raising livestock, which is massively inefficient if you compare to using that same amount of land for growing arable crops, even if you didn't care about the animals at all. At the moment, we grow a third of the global cereal crop we grow, instead of giving it to hungry human beings, is fed to livestock so rich human beings can consume their bodies. It doesn't make any kind of sense. Exactly the same dynamics operate in terms of water security. Water is a major issue in terms of global security. And raising livestock is a massively wasteful way of using very scarce water supplies. You're probably aware that raising livestock is very problematic in relation to climate change as well. Probably more than global transport emissions as a whole is generated by raising livestock. So again, even if you didn't care anything for the animals themselves, one of the major things that environmentalists say to us is a key thing we could do is stop eating meat or massively reduce the amount of animal products we're consuming. But the benefits go more widely. There are serious scientists studying epidemics like swine flu and bird flu that are seriously worried that if we continue raising animals in intensive contexts as we're doing at the moment, we are going to incubate a huge pandemic which will be very serious for human health. And that's quite apart from the human health problems that are caused by massive overconsumption of fat from animal products. And there's also the problem of antibiotic resistance. Because we need to control disease in these intensive contexts, we feed farmed animals antibiotics, which means those antibiotics are no longer effective when we need them to control infections. So it seems to me, far from there being any kind of quid pro quo between trying to be kinder to animals, as I'm suggesting Christians have good reason to do, versus human interests, actually everything points in the same direction. For any number of reasons, we need to get used to either stopping consuming animal products or consuming them at much lower levels if we're going to be ethically responsible as Christians. So I'm suggesting to you that Christians in particular have reason to think very, very seriously and be very, very uncomfortable at what we're currently doing to farmed animals. That our faith in God as creator of all and as sustainer of all and as the God who will redeem all. And I'm a Methodist local preacher, and John Wesley preached a famous sermon on Romans 8 where he said nothing could be clearer but that the whole of creation is going to be part of that redeemed life. If we take seriously what our faith means, it means that God is not only interested in one kind of animal on this planet, the human ones. God has interests across that magnificent diversity of God's being. So what would be stopping us from stopping killing other animals for food, or cutting down very substantially on the numbers of animal products we're consuming? Well, food is a deep habit in terms of how we are raised and how we grow up and what food practices mean in relation to our families. I'm very deeply aware of that. And so maybe for many people it's hard to think of how we could switch to a different diet all at once. But that's not a reason for doing nothing. Breakfast is a really easy meal to start with. There's a wonderful array of non-dairy milks that you can now find on supermarket shelves. And if you like cereal for breakfast, that's probably the most straightforward switch you could make. And the intensification of dairy production in this country is a whole nother story that I haven't had time to go into, but calves taken away from their mothers before they even get to suckle once. And so dairy is a really significant welfare concern too. So you could start with breakfast, or you could start with just one evening meal. How could I make a meal without using animal products? Or you could think about one day a week. There are deep Christian traditions of fasting that took seriously a rhythm in which animal products were not consumed on Fridays or during Lent and so on. The Coptic Orthodox Church, I think about a third or two-thirds of the year is basically vegan because of the number of festivals they have where they need to avoid animal products. So you could start with one day a week, a Monday, a meat-free Monday, or a meat-free Friday. Or you could commit to next Lent, having a Lent free of animal products. Or you could start, if you search for starting vegan, you can find all kinds of suggestions for different ways to begin to look at that. And I would also urge you, if you continue to consume animal products at lower levels, take seriously thinking about where they come from. So sourcing from local farmers markets and talking to the farmers who are raising the animals will give you a good sense. You might even be able to visit the farms and get a sense of the lives that the animals are living. But if you just buy chicken off the shelf or from a takeaway, you can be absolutely confident that the life that chicken has led is identical to the one that I held in that broiler shed. So do exercise your imagination in terms of thinking about the lives of the animals behind products you are consuming. Now, I appreciate that we're all living complicated lives, and we're all beset by many personal and familial and social challenges, and God knows caring for animals is not the only pressing social issue that Christians are called to respond to. But it seems to me there are some questions that we have very little levers of control over. In relation to the threat of terrorism, we can choose to live in one way or another, but there's very little we're going to be able to do to resolve that particular issue. What strikes me as being very, very healthy for focusing on this issue is, first of all, it's an issue of daily practice, and Christians have been very good at thinking about ways of practicing everyday life in accordance with faith. And so eating is something that we all do, and we can choose to make that part of our faith life. And also, as I said, it's connected in really serious ways to all other kinds of social issues. So avoiding animal products or cutting down animal products is a way of addressing human poverty and human food insecurity and water insecurity. It's a way of addressing the problem that migrant workers are the ones that are, in the main, the ones that are forced to work in the meat processing plants that are so horrific. It's a way of addressing ecological change and addressing greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so on. And so here we've got an ordinary practice deeply embedded in our Christian tradition. We've got really good reasons for thinking seriously that it matters in relation to the animals, and it also connects us to all of those wider challenges. So we'll take a break now, and then perhaps when we come back, I can ask you again, and you can tell me what's stopping you.